White athletic tape ripped with a sharp tearing sound that cut through the low hum of the gym's box fans. Billionaires buy yachts. Arthur bought black belts. He walked into the strip mall dojo looking for cheap grit to test his expensive technique, pointing his camera crew at the guy taping a blown knee. He picked the wrong ghost. White tape peeled from the roll, jagged and fraying at the edges. Roy bit the end of it, tearing a 4-inch strip, and wrapped it in an X pattern over the swollen knuckle of his right index finger. His hands looked like crushed walnuts. They felt worse. At 38, his body was a ledger of bad decisions and unavoidable collisions, the most permanent of which was a mortar blast in Helmand that had turned his L4 vertebra into a lifelong ache. He didn't come to Southside grappling to win medals. He came because the physical exhaustion was the only thing loud enough to drown out the quiet, creeping panic of raising an 8-year-old girl on a plumber's salary. The mat smelled of bleach, stale sweat, and cheap antifungal soap. To Roy, it smelled like the only honest place left in the city. He adjusted his GI lapel. The fabric was a faded, dingy gray, originally white 3 years ago before hundreds of washes had beaten the life out of the cotton. He was tired. His eyes burned from a lack of sleep, and his right knee throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He had exactly 1 hour to drill, sweat out the frustration of a blown head gasket on his truck, and get to his sister's house to pick up Lily before she fell asleep on the couch. Then the front door chimed and the air in the room shifted. Arthur Pendleton did not walk into rooms. He arrived. The tech mogul pushed through the glass door, flanked by a quiet, muscular man holding a gym bag and a kid with a messy top knot operating a gimbal camera. Arthur wore a crisp, unbleached hemp gi that probably cost more than Roy's monthly grocery budget. His black belt was tied perfectly. The red bar faded just enough to suggest experience, though the fabric itself looked soft, supple, bobbied. The gym owner, Greg, practically tripped over his own feet rushing to the front desk. Greg was a good guy, but the pandemic had hit the gym hard. The rent was late, the mats had tiers covered with duct tape. A billionaire walking into the room was like a localized weather event. It sucked the oxygen out of the space. Roy watched from the edge of the mat, stretching his hamstrings. He felt a dull, familiar irritation prickle at the base of his neck. He recognized the type. Arthur was 40-something, lean, optimized. The kind of guy who took ice baths in his living room, microdosed psilocybin, and talked about jiu-jitsu on podcasts as kinetic chess or ego death. He smelled like expensive sandalwood and ozone. He didn't smell like a guy who had ever worried about his debit card declining at a gas station. "We're shooting a mini doc," Arthur was telling Greg, his voice carrying that booming, frictionless confidence of the ultra-rich. "Testing the water in local rooms. I want raw. I want the real culture. You mind if we get some rounds in?" "Of course, Mr. Pendleton. It's an honor," Greg said, wiping his palms on his sweatpants. Roy stopped stretching and lay flat on his back, staring up at the water-stained acoustic tiles of the ceiling. "Just let me do my hour and leave," he thought. But Arthur wasn't looking at the young, athletic competitors warming up by the heavy bags. He wasn't looking at Greg. Arthur was scanning the room for a narrative. He wanted a prop. His eyes swept over the pristine rash guards and landed on the far corner of the mat. He saw a man with heavy bags under his eyes, a faded Marine Corps tattoo peeking out from beneath a rash guard that had lost its elasticity, and a purple belt tied haphazardly around a frayed GI. Roy looked authentic. He looked like the working class. He looked broken. "Him," Arthur said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger. The gimbal camera smoothly pivoted, its glass eyes zooming in on Roy, who was just trying to massage a knot out of his calf. "What's his story?" "That's Roy," Greg said, his voice dropping a decibel. He's a tough role, veteran, single dad. He doesn't compete much anymore." "Perfect," Arthur smiled, adjusting his belt. It was a hungry smile, but completely devoid of malice. That was what irritated Roy the most. Arthur didn't want to hurt him. Arthur wanted to consume his struggle to make himself look more profound. "Let's get some rounds." Roy sat up, the joints in his lower back popping in a dull staccato. Greg was walking over, looking apologetic but desperate. "Roy," Greg muttered, squatting down. "Please, just 5 minutes. He's offering to cover the gym's rent for 6 months from his foundation just to film here. Don't murder him, but don't play dead. Just give him a look." Roy looked at Greg. He looked at the duct tape on the mats. He thought about Lily, who needed new shoes for school next week. He tasted stale coffee at the back of his throat. He hated this. He hated the cameras. He hated the crisp white hemp of Arthur's GI, and he hated the dignity was always so easily priced. 5 minutes, Roy grunted, pushing himself up off the mat. His knee screamed, a sharp spike of nerve pain, but his face remained a blank stony mask. Keep the camera out of my face. Stepping onto the center, Matt felt different this time. Usually the tatami was a refuge. Tonight it felt like a stage, and Roy despised theater. Arthur approached, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. He had the loose, fluid movement of a man who spent 3 hours a day with private mobility coaches. His breathing was measured, nasal, rhythmic. Roy just stood there, flat-footed, feeling the heavy, humid air of the gym cling to his skin. "Respect, brother," Arthur said, extending a hand to slap and bump, the traditional jiu-jitsu greeting. His voice was patronizingly solemn. "Thank you for your service, let's work." Roy didn't say anything. He met Arthur's hand, slapped the palm, bumped knuckles, and immediately dropped his center of gravity. Arthur initiated. He was fast, terrifyingly fast. Money buys the best instruction on earth, and Arthur's technique was a flawless replication of world-class instructionals. He dropped to his back, establishing a complex open guard, his grip snapping onto Roy's lapels with the sharp crack of a whip. Arthur's hands were incredibly strong, but they were soft. No calluses, no grit. Roy felt the tension in Arthur's grips and immediately recognized the game. It was a young man's game, a rich man's game. It relied on speed, inversion, and flexibility. Roy didn't play that game. He couldn't. His back wouldn't let him. Instead, Roy clamped his elbows to his ribs, dropped his hips, and became dead weight. He didn't try to pass Arthur's guard with flashy footwork. He just sank his grips into the soft hemp of Arthur's pants, pinned the billionaire's hips to the floor, and drove his forehead straight into Arthur's chest. It was ugly. It was suffocating. It was the grappling equivalent of pouring concrete. For the first 2 minutes, Arthur flowed. He transitioned from spider guard to de la Riva, trying to off-balance Roy. But Roy was a man who spent 10 hours a day wrestling rusted iron pipes and carrying 60 lb water heaters up narrow staircases. He had a different kind of balance. Every time Arthur tried to sweep, Roy simply adjusted his base, grinding his shoulder a fraction of an inch deeper into Arthur's jawline. The gimbal operator circled them like a vulture, the red recording light blinking steadily. Arthur's breathing began to change. The measured nasal rhythm broke, replaced by sharp, frustrated gasps. The technique was failing because the technique assumed the opponent would react logically. Roy wasn't reacting. He was just surviving, crushing the space between them. "Come on, man," Arthur hissed under his breath, his ego bruising faster than his flesh. "Move," Roy remained silent. A drop of sweat fell from his nose onto Arthur's pristine lapel, leaving a dark gray stain. Frustration is a dangerous thing in combat. It makes you abandon the map. Arthur, realizing his polished techniques were drowning in Roy's sheer immovable gravity, decided to use force. He framed his forearm aggressively against Roy's throat, bridging his hips violently to create space. It was a sharp, jarring movement. Arthur's forearm caught Roy right on the Adam's apple, grinding into the cartilage. It was entirely legal, but it was mean. It crossed the invisible line between a friendly spar and a fight. Pain flared in Roy's neck. A sudden metallic taste flooded his mouth. Something inside the veteran fractured. It wasn't a cinematic rage. He didn't see red. It was actually the opposite. The room went terrifyingly quiet. The hum of the box fans vanished. The squeak of feet on the vinyl faded into a dull, underwater echo. Roy's vision narrowed until all he could see was the pulse beating frantically in the hollow of Arthur's neck. Roy had spent his whole life swallowing dirt. He swallowed it in the desert. He swallowed it when his ex-wife left. He swallowed it when his landlord raised the rent. He was supposed to swallow it now, for Greg, for the gym. For the billionaire playing tourist in the House of Pain. No, Roy shifted his weight. It was a microscopic adjustment, a mere rotation of his left hip, but it completely collapsed the structure of Arthur's defensive frame. The billionaire gasped as the air was forced from his lungs by 200 lb of dense, unyielding, working-class bone. Arthur pushed harder, panic fluttering in his chest. He threw a heavy, desperate cross face, his palm slapping hard against Roy's ear. Roy didn't blink. He just let go of Arthur's pants, reached up, and grabbed the billionaire's impeccably tied black belt. The fabric felt foreign, too smooth, entirely untested by the kind of desperation that keeps a man awake at 3:00 a.m. Roy wrapped his thick, taped fingers around the belt, dug his boots into the tape-covered mat, and began to drag Arthur into deep water. Gravity has a taste. It tastes like copper, swallowed spit, and stale air. Arthur Pendleton realized this the exact moment Roy's right shoulder bypassed his hip and settled heavily against his jawline. The transition wasn't a blur of motion. It was a slow, agonizing crawl, a glacier of coarse cotton and bruised bone grinding past Arthur's elaborate guard. Arthur had spent tens of thousands of dollars on private seminars, learning to invert, to spin beneath larger opponents, to use leverage like a scalpel. But leverage requires space. Roy was currently engaged in the wholesale eradication of space. Roy's left arm swam under Arthur's neck, the frayed cuff of his GI scraping roughly against the billionaire's meticulously shaved throat. Roy didn't interlock his hands. Instead, he grabbed a fistful of Arthur's pristine, unbleached lapel, tightened it like a tourniquet, and dropped his hips. The mat groaned beneath them. The box fans in the corner continued their rhythmic, rattling hum, but the ambient noise of the gym had flatlined. The younger competitors on the adjacent mats had stopped their own rolls. They were watching. Greg, the owner, stood near the front desk, nervously chewing his lower lip, a damp towel clutched in his fist. Arthur's breathing hitched. His expensive VO2 max conditioning, cultivated in hyperbaric chambers and high-altitude training masks, meant absolutely nothing when an anvil was resting on his diaphragm. He tried to frame, pushing his forearms against Roy's chest. The muscle fibers in Arthur's triceps fired, straining to create just an inch of daylight, but pushing against Roy was like trying to push a parked truck uphill. Roy didn't muscle back. He simply relaxed his dead weight, allowing gravity and dense calcified working-class bone to do the work. Roy's L4 vertebra throbbed, a dull, sickening pulse that radiated down his sciatic nerve. His right knee felt like it was packed with crushed glass. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at him to back off, to protect his joints so he could climb under a rusted sink tomorrow morning. But a quiet, spiteful engine had turned over in his chest. Arthur had wanted a ghost. He had wanted poverty tourism. He had wanted a prop to demonstrate his kinetic chest for a camera crew. Roy was going to give him an eviction notice. With a slight shift of his weight, Roy turned his chin and buried it into the soft, unprotected tissue of Arthur's ribs. It was a miserable, grinding sensation. Arthur gasped, a short, ragged sound that lacked any of his previous podcast-ready confidence. The billionaire's hips bridged frantically, bucking upward in a desperate attempt to dislodge the pressure. Roy floated effortlessly with the movement, surfing the bridge, and when Arthur exhausted his hips and slammed back down to the mat, Roy dropped with him, sinking an inch deeper. The gimbal camera hovered a few feet away. The kid operating it stepped back, no longer trying to get dramatic low angles. The atmosphere in the room was too heavy, too real. There was nothing cinematic happening here. It was just one man systematically dismantling another's belief that he was safe. Arthur's soft, uncalloused hands pawed at Roy's GI. His fingers, lacking the grip strength born from holding wrenches and hauling water heaters, slipped off the sweat-soaked cotton. He tried to lock up a half-guard, wrapping his legs around Roy's bad knee. Pain flared in Roy's joint, sharp and bright. Roy didn't wince. He just stared straight down into Arthur's eyes. Arthur's pupils were dilated, darting wildly as the primal panic of suffocation began to override his expensive prefrontal cortex. Arthur smelled like ozone, sandalwood, and fear. It was a sour, sharp odor that cut through the gym's native scent of bleach and worn vinyl. "Breathe," Roy whispered. His voice was a rasp, barely audible over the squeak of sweaty skin against the mat. It wasn't advice. It was a command that Arthur found physically impossible to follow. Roy began to walk his hips toward Arthur's head, isolating the billionaire's nearer arm. This was the north-south position. It was a fundamental pin devoid of flash or flare. Roy flattened his chest completely over Arthur's face. The heavy, sweat-drenched gray cotton of Roy's GI became a wet blanket smothering Arthur's nose and mouth. Arthur thrashed. His legs kicked out, heels drumming uselessly against the duct-taped mat. He threw his free arm over Roy's back, trying to pry him off. The frantic, jerky movements were the antithesis of the smooth, flowing jiu-jitsu Arthur loved to philosophize about. This wasn't kinetic chess anymore. This was a man drowning in a puddle. Roy closed his eyes. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt deeply, profoundly tired. The adrenaline spike was already fading, leaving behind the familiar, hollow ache of exhaustion. He thought about his truck, hoping it would start in the damp night air. He thought about his daughter Lily, asleep on his sister's cheap velvet couch, clutching her frayed, stuffed rabbit. He didn't hate Arthur. He just wanted Arthur to understand the difference between playing at survival and actually having to survive. Arthur's thrashing weakened. Lactic acid flooded his muscles, turning his arms to lead. The pristine hemp GI was now soaked, stained with Roy's sweat and a faint smudge of blood from the scraped knuckle. Arthur's lungs burned, screaming for oxygen that the heavy, suffocating pressure denied him. Roy adjusted his grip, sliding his forearm under Arthur's chin. He didn't apply a choke. He didn't need to. He simply dropped his shoulder, transferring all 200 lb of his body weight directly onto Arthur's jaw. 3 frantic slaps echoed through the quiet gym. Tap, tap, tap. It was the universal sound of surrender. Arthur's hand hit the mat with the desperate, chaotic energy of a man touching a hot stove. Roy didn't linger. He didn't wait an extra second to assert dominance. The instant he felt the vibration of the tap, the pressure vanished. Roy peeled himself off Arthur, rolling backward and climbing to his feet in one fluid, albeit stiff, motion. The sudden vacuum of space felt shocking in the humid room. Arthur sat up violently, sucking in massive, jagged lungfuls of air. He coughed, a harsh, wet sound clutching his ribs. His face was flushed crimson, imprinted with the weave pattern of Roy's cheap dye eye across his cheek. The perfectly tied black belt was currently hanging loose around his hips, the knot undone, the fabric twisted and chaotic. The silence in the gym was absolute. The gimbal operator had lowered his camera, staring at the floor. Greg was frozen by the front desk, terrified that his 6 months of rent had just evaporated. Roy stood a few feet away, chest heaving slowly. He didn't look down at Arthur with contempt or pride. He was already looking past him at the digital clock mounted on the far wall. It read 8:42 p.m. He was going to be late. Without a word, Roy turned his back on the billionaire. He walked to the edge of the mat, his right foot dragging slightly as the adrenaline receded, and the sharp ache in his knee took over. He grabbed his water bottle, a scratched plastic gallon jug, and took a small sip. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly of plastic, but it cleared the metallic tang of blood from his mouth. Behind him, he heard the rustle of heavy hemp fabric. Arthur was getting up. Roy picked up a roll of white athletic tape from his gym bag and began to pick at the frayed edges wrapped around his fingers. "Hey," Arthur called out. His voice was completely stripped of its usual booming resonance. It sounded thin, ratty human. Roy didn't turn around right away. He focused on peeling the tape off his crushed index finger, wincing as the adhesive pulled at his hair and skin. Finally, he balled the tape up, tossed it into a nearby trash can, and looked over his shoulder. Arthur was standing in the center of the mat. His posture was different. The bounce was gone. The casual, optimized arrogance had been scraped away, leaving a 40-something man who looked suddenly aware of his own mortality. Arthur stared at Roy, his chest still rising and falling unevenly. He looked at Roy's faded guy, at the dark circles under his eyes, at the heavy taped hands. Arthur slowly raised his right hand, extending it toward Roy. It wasn't the casual slap bump of a tourist. It was a quiet, deliberate gesture. Roy stared at the hand for a long moment. He felt the ache in his lower back, the pressure in his skull, the lingering irritation of being used as a prop. He sighed, a low, exhausted sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire week. He limped back onto the mat, closing the distance. He didn't smile. He reached out and gripped Arthur's hand. Arthur's grip was weaker than it had been 5 minutes ago, but it felt more honest. "Thank you," Arthur said. The words were simple, lacking any podcast rhetoric about ego or deep water. He just looked tired. "Yeah," Roy muttered, releasing the hand. Keep your elbows tighter when you play open guard. Roy turned away and walked back to his bag. He unzipped it, the sound loud in the quiet gym, and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of shattered glass over the display. There was one text message from his sister. "Lily's asking for you. Come get your kid." Roy shoved the phone into his pocket. He stripped off his GI top, revealing a plain, sweat-stained, and stuffed the heavy cotton into his bag. He slung the strap over his shoulder, the canvas digging into his collarbone. As he walked toward the front door, Greg intercepted him. The gym owner looked pale, glancing between Roy and the billionaire, who was currently sitting on the edge of the mat, staring blankly at his own hands while the cameraman packed up the gimbal. Greg started, his voice a frantic whisper. "Man, did you have to crush him like that?" Roy paused. He looked at Greg, noticing the deep worry lines around the younger man's eyes, the fraying collar of his polo shirt. Roy reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill and pressed it into Greg's hand. "For the water," Roy said quietly. "You'll still pay your rent, Greg." Guys like him, they pay for the experience. Tonight he got the full package. Roy pushed the glass door open. The night air hit him instantly, cool and smelling of wet asphalt, exhaust fumes, and the distant metallic scent of the harbor. It was a gritty, ugly smell, but it belonged to him. He walked across the poorly lit parking lot toward his truck. It was a 10-year-old Ford, the paint chipped, the bed filled with PVC pipes and heavy canvas tool bags. He unlocked the door with a physical key, climbed into the cab, and sat there for a moment in the dark. The vinyl seat was cracked, pinching his thigh. The steering wheel was sticky. His whole body hummed with a low-grade, persistent pain. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the headrest. He had won a fight he never asked for against a man he didn't care about in a room he paid to suffer in. There was no trophy. There was no viral video. He knew Arthur's crew would delete that footage before they even reached the highway. There was only the ache in his joints and the reality of Monday morning looming in the distance. Roy turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life, shaking the entire chassis. He threw the truck into gear and pulled out of the parking lot, the headlights cutting a yellow swath through the darkness. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the cramped driveway of his sister's duplex. The porch light was flickering, casting long, erratic shadows across the dying lawn. Roy killed the engine, took a deep breath, and walked up the steps. His sister was asleep in the armchair, the television playing a late-night infomercial at a low volume. On the sofa, buried under a faded quilt, was Lily. Roy walked over quietly. The anger, the spite, the cold, heavy gravity he had weaponized on the mat, all of it evaporated the moment he looked at her. Her face was smudged with dried marker, one arm thrown overhead, fingers twitching in sleep. He knelt by the sofa, his bad knee popping loudly in the quiet room. He didn't care. He carefully slid one arm under her back and the other beneath her knees. She was getting heavy, too heavy to carry like this much longer, but he refused to acknowledge it. As he lifted her, Lily stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. She smelled like apple juice in sleep. "Daddy," she mumbled, her small hands instinctively grabbing a fistful of his shirt. "I got you, kiddo," Roy whispered, his voice incredibly soft, a stark contrast to the rasp that had commanded a billionaire to breathe. "Let's go home." She rested her head against his shoulder, her breathing instantly sinking with his slow, heavy footsteps. Roy walked out the door carrying his daughter into the cool night. His back ached, his knee throbbed, his hands were battered. But as he held her tight against his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of her heart, he knew he wasn't broken. He was just carrying the weight, and for tonight that was more than enough. If you felt the raw reality of Roy's journey and believed that true strength isn't bought, but forged in the quiet struggles of everyday life, don't keep this story to yourself. Hit that like button to show your support for the unsung, working-class heroes grinding it out every single day. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder about what real grit looks like, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more grounded, hard-hitting stories. Keep fighting.